This is Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer, a podcast where Tim and his friends engage in purposeful conversation about identity, parenting, culture, faith, and more. Tim Stauffer is a professor of counseling and a licensed clinical counselor. My name is Sam Meyung, and I'm Tim's friend. My life has been greatly enriched by my time talking to Tim and getting his thoughts on many matters that impact my life daily. After listening to this podcast, I hope you'll feel the same. Guideposts are discernment markers. They provide opportunities for direction as well as warnings of pitfalls. Go this way and be careful of that way. We hope that each episode provides some sense of direction as we navigate the challenges of daily life. Thanks so much for listening. A quick disclaimer, the content of this podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your licensed mental health provider.
All right, friends, welcome to this episode of Guideposts. And Sam, today I'm excited to introduce a good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Kreimeyer, Joshua Kreimeyer, and we're going to be talking about his work in Ukraine. And I've been excited to have this conversation for quite some time. And so, Sam, say hello to Josh, and Josh, say hello to Sam.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Yes. So welcome aboard our podcast, Josh. We are thrilled to have you here and to hear a bit about your work. You sent me a bio, so let me just introduce our audience a bit to some of your history and what you do, and then we'll dive into our conversation. So Dr. Josh Kreimeyer, he currently lives in Colorado. Early in his career, he enlisted in the U.S. Army as a cryptologic linguist. He and his family had served in California, Texas, and Germany, with some side excursions for him in Kosovo in 1999 and in Iraq in 2003. After his service in the military, he transitioned to the field of counseling and obtained a postgraduate certificate in marriage and family therapy. He also completed his PhD in counselor education and supervision at Regis University, and through his studies there has participated in the groundbreaking efforts to bring the field of trauma-informed counseling to the mental health providers in Ukraine. And he currently serves as faculty at Open Doors Center in Kyiv. So, Dr. Kreimeyer, can we call you Josh for today?
Yeah, that's great.
Welcome aboard. So what would you like to add to your introduction? Tell us some about the work that you have been doing. I think my interest is particularly in hearing about your recent work in Ukraine, and perhaps set up some of the history of how you got involved in that country, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I appreciate being here too, and the opportunity to share a little bit, about this groundbreaking work. So I would add to the bio that my PhD studies concluded in 2019, and through that stage of my own development, we went from doing some trainings for lay people in a church and other. Some of them were psychologists as well, but we did kind of psychological first aid trainings for people working with those affected by the war, which really has been ongoing for years. That's how many Ukrainians view it. But the most current iteration was around 2014, with things amping up, of course, over the last year. But we started with these trainings, and it progressed very quickly to become what is now the first accredited master's degree in counseling in the country of Ukraine. And so we have an institute, the International Institute of Postgraduate Education, which is registered with the Ministry of Education in Ukraine. The credits count at one of the national universities there. So it's a legit program. And it's also accredited with IRSEP, which is the international version of what our counseling programs in the US and the West get accredited with. So we have those two things that have developed really since 2019 even. We got the accreditation in 2020, I believe. And then I've been doing my own side work as well. I had a contract for the UN. I worked for an organization within the UN called the International Office of Migration, and I've done work with military families through them and some other trainings too. Like I most recently trained their crisis hotline workers. Um, so yeah, it's work that started in my own studies in a PhD and has just continued to expand, and very timely, to meet the needs of what's going on in that country right now.
Yeah. Yeah. How would you describe the impact that that the current crisis just in the past few months has had on your work and on the your friends? And I know reaching out to you periodically across the past few months, your friends were suffering terribly and have suffered a great deal of loss as well. How are they doing? Um, and tell us a bit about the current events in that country.
Sure. So if you anybody knows the symbol of Ukraine, it's very common to see the flag, the colors of the flag. Yellow on the bottom symbolizes the wheat. Ukraine's known as the breadbasket of Europe, and they produce like 2/3 of the grain for all of Europe, something like that, some crazy high amount. And then the blue is the sky above. It's not official, but sometimes on the flag they'll have superimposed the trident. It kind of looks like a pitchfork. It's symbolized almost everywhere in the country. You see it all over. So again, it's not on the official flag, but sometimes they put it on there. That trident has within it the Cyrillic letters for the word volia, which means will. And the will of the people of Ukraine is incredible. I'm so glad the rest of the world gets to see how amazing these people are now. People know stories of, um, really some pretty miraculous things with God's hand being very evident in my opinion, in what's happening. But more importantly, the people are just so strong and so resilient. But I have seen recently that will dampen. I feel like the people have been expectant of help from the international community. They've been overwhelmed with money and things, right? But they haven't gotten the military support, I think, to help offset quite a bit of loss. I feel like that's what they feel. They've talked to me and post a lot on social media about if we could just get some help closing the sky. That's actually the phrase they use a lot, because they don't have those resources. They've used the military resources the world has sent, and they're amazing warriors. Um, but they're getting tired. They're getting, a lot of the people are just kind of numb at this point. I don't think they thought it would happen, and I don't think they thought it would be going on this long after they started pushing back the Russian forces in a pretty amazing way. The military community has really looked in awe at what they have done. Um, but it's still going on. It's still some pretty horrific things happening, despite it losing its luster in our mainstream media. You don't see as much posted about it anymore. Um, but yeah, it's still going on every day. So I feel like the spirit has dampened a little bit, and it's definitely impacted my work too. We were actually planning on moving to the country sometime this year. We actually had plans to do that. That has been put on hold for now. My wife wants to wait until the State Department says it's safe to move there, which I understand. If it was just me, I would be there right now. I would have been there. I would have stayed because I was there in February, like a week before the Russians crossed the border. That was one of my recent trips. And I've been back this summer, but it took me several months. I was there February. I didn't go back until the end of May. And normally I've been going 3 or 4 times a year, usually. So it's definitely slowed down what I've been able to do, but I've done a lot more online.
Mm-hmm. So,
What do, if I may, what do those trips consist of when you visit and go to Ukraine?
That's a great question, Sam. It's always so interesting to realize how complex my life has gotten. With all the very, like, it's not a simple answer, but so just to walk through the most recent work, in December and January and February, I was in Ukraine doing work through the UN. I was a contractor. They contract me to do two different things. I did training for some of their hotline workers. They were setting up a crisis hotline. And then I also did two experiential retreats for military families. So we did one in Kiev and we did one on the border of Romania, which is in the Carpathian Mountains. And we had 10 families at each retreat. This is a model that I had built. I had been doing these retreats here in the US for several years. And I pitched it to them, and they wanted to do a pilot study, kind of. They didn't do an official study, but they wanted to pilot these retreats. My life's work, my passion right now is these retreats. In a country like Ukraine, like many countries in the world, there's such a stigma against mental health, reaching out for help. It's more than a stigma, though, because what happened in former Soviet countries is psychology was weaponized. It was used to cause harm. So people don't just have a fear or a stigma, it's like a fear and a bona fide uh, and justified, really, fear of reaching out for help. They don't understand
Wow.
that counseling is really different and it can help them in different ways. So these retreats, my vision has been to not just do these fun retreats because people are more likely to accept that kind of help. Like they'll go for a weekend away somewhere, food and room and board, all that are provided. Um, but really, to me, it's a gateway to the mental health that we've built, the new people we've trained. So I have at these retreats, I have 10 psychologists and 10 families. And I make a joke at the beginning of the retreat. I say, I know you got families, but I'd like you to consider adopting one more child, one of these psychologists. And at the retreat, then they can check in with the family. I tell them we're not going to get up in your business every day, but we're there for you. So I train the psychologist to check in with the families, have a meal with them. And this kind of rapport and bridge building in that different environment breaks down that barrier so that 9 out of the 10 families actually reached out for ongoing care after the retreat. That was my hope and prayer. That was what I wanted to happen. So the UN folks got to see that. I got to see it. I had done a few other retreats, but this was the big one, and it was supported financially. It wasn't just piecemeal together like we've done before, a bunch of ragtag folks just like trying to have some fun with the families. And we did some good stuff, but this was incredible, this work. Um, and yeah, so it really worked. That was February, and then I left a week after, or a week before, excuse me, the invasion. Um, and then in between the invasion, I did a few more online trainings through the UN. I did do one online course through our program, through the institute that we built, a marriage and family therapy course. And then I was like, at some point, I was like, I have to go. I knew that I had to be back in the country. I just felt such a strong calling. Things had settled enough. They had pushed the Russian forces back more to the east. And I said, I got to go. So I reached out to a couple friends who had contacts in Ukraine. And on our own, we just created what we called the Avengers. That's the image that came to my mind. We all had these different superpowers. We established this team. I, of course, was Captain America. And we had Wanda, the Scarlet Witch, or whatever her name is, and then Thor. So the three of us set off on this adventure, and so this was in May into June. I went back, and this was interesting because I knew then that I wanted to work with the workers of with the refugees. I didn't. There's so many refugees. There's a few million or more people that have fled the country. And I said, we can't touch and have touch points with all of them, but the workers that I'm friends with were so burned out and so fatigued. I was like, I want to make impact with them. So I just reached out to contacts that I had made through my travels, and Jason and Alina, the other two I went with, the Avengers team. And we kept it small on purpose so we could all fit in one car, not be a burden on the resources that were already limited for the refugees. We were very deliberate. A lot of people wanted to go help. We're like, it's not time yet to have big groups. It's not safe, and for many different reasons. Anyhow, this trip we went and we each had contacts in different places. We went to Warsaw and we did some work with refugees there. Then we drove across the border. We went in the west, in the central and west of the country of Ukraine. We hit three different cities and worked in churches, community centers. We worked at a seminary once. We had a contact at a seminary. And then we drove along the border of Moldova and Romania into Hungary. And we did work in Hungary for a few days. We put on a trauma conference for refugee workers in Hungary, where just in that country alone, they had 800,000 refugees that they've tracked from Ukraine coming in. And in that country, it was super cool because even in the grocery stores, they had the announcements in Hungarian, English, and Ukrainian. They added the Ukrainian like special in aisle 4, and you'd hear it in 3 languages. And so they're very supportive. But yeah, the work is heavy. So it was heavy work for us too to ease some of that burden and give them some tools. So yeah, February, June, or I'm sorry, May into June, and I'm planning the next trip now.
Yes. That's fascinating and powerful work that you're doing. You mentioned a bit ago that psychology has been weaponized and people are afraid of getting care. When you think about our industry or our career field in the mental health world, what would you describe are the basic gifts that the mental health field has to offer that people there desperately need and really resonate with when they receive those gifts?
Yeah, so the immediate, that's a great question. The immediate thing that comes to mind is a book that I read during my dissertation process, which I did do my dissertation in Ukraine. I actually did an outcome study looking at the impact of the therapists we trained, the first generation of therapists. I wanted to see if our work was uh, training them to the same level of other therapists and counselors around the world. So I studied outcome data from the first 10 sessions of counseling with our therapists in Ukraine, and then I compared that to 6 different countries around the world and found that we were training our therapists to the same level. They were helping clients improve, decrease the negative and increase the positive symptoms. Um, and it was significantly connected. So in that process, little plug for that. Thanks for letting me get that in. But yeah, from that work, I looked at a book that was a random book that's not even in circulation anymore about uh, Russian psychologists who got to see Carl Rogers before he died, after the wall fell, and before Carl Rogers died, like 2 years I think before he died. He went and did a training and demonstration in Moscow. In this book that I read, there was 9 psychologists that talked about their experience at this training with one man. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. 9 psychologists had enough to say about one training with one human, you know? And I know Carl Rogers did big things for highlighting the fundamental foundation of what counseling is and what effective counseling is and building relationships that are therapeutic. Um, but it was amazing to read this book that every single one of these psychologists were life changingly impacted by one 2 day training with Carl Rogers. What Carl Rogers did was not just give them information, he actually did a demonstration of what he's talking about, pulled people up on stage in a small group. And he kind of embodied one of my mantras, has come to be, and little nuggets of wisdom from the field has been, it's not what we do, it's how we are with people. That's what's important. Because a lot of the therapists I train now are like, what do I do? What's the thing to do? And it's like, yeah, there's things, there's interventions and things, but it's more about how we are with people. Carl Rogers, of course, embodied this. And so all of these psychologists were just, they were like life before and life after this meeting and interaction with this person. That I believe is highlights what's needed in much of the post-Soviet world. They have a thing they call stone face, kamenoya litso. That's how they say it in Cyrillic, in the Russian and Ukrainian. And it means stone face. Like when you're walking around in public, I don't fit in. I've got this big American smile. They think I'm up to something, and I'm trying to interact with people. I've learned to adopt this stone face when I go, and I get stone faced. I'm not. I change. I adapt culturally when I'm there. But this is what they need. This is the essence of counseling.
So tell our audience, you and I know um, precisely what you mean when you say Carl Rogers, and we could we have all of his things that he taught that are just kind of basic counseling theory and how we connect with and how we are with people. Describe just a little bit about Carl Rogers and what were those things that he really kind of imprinted onto the mental health field that are kind of those basic get what I would call gifts to help to the people helping field.
Sure. So Carl Rogers was one of the foundational kind of thinker and theorist for person-centered therapy, as we call it today. And he really titrated down and highlighted and studied too the fundamental aspects of relationship that matter to help people feel comfortable in doing the work they need to do to overcome whatever they've endured in life, whether it's anxiety, depression that they're experiencing. He said, hey, what matters most is the relationship. The things that he highlighted, a couple of them were unconditional positive regard, holding people to the highest esteem and regard, like valuing them as a person and a human, regardless of anything. Like, just this is a human, right? A fellow journeyer on this journey of life, who's gone through things just like we have too. He also took the approach of, who are we? We're not any better or any different than anybody else. We just happen to have some training and knowledge and experience, and maybe have our stuff together enough to be stable enough to try to help this other person navigate what they're doing. But unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and these things are deceptively simple. People, if they haven't studied or trained in these ways, they go, oh yeah, that makes sense, be genuine. But it's ridiculous how powerful these things are, and again, deceptively simple.
Right. So give us an example, if you, or a story that you might have experienced, like what kind of impact happens for someone who is traumatized, who is living in a great deal of fear, uh, and they experience genuineness, empathy, a sense of positive regard for them.
Sure.
What do you see happen in the lives of the people when you share that gift with them?
So the first example that came into my mind was the very first experience I had in Ukraine. We were just teaching what we thought would be a post bachelor's kind of training for psychologists, a certificate. That's how we called it. So I was training what we call our skills class. We teach basic skills that are really person centered, such as summarizing what somebody has said, reflecting something back. So we do learn some skills, but again, it's all predicated and founded upon the relationship. So we did this training all week, and I had like an hour and a half, 2 hours at the end of Friday. And I said, hey, good work, everybody. This was an amazing training. We have 2 hours left. What would you like to do? And a few different people raised their hands, and they're like, we would like to see you. You said you would do this is my bad Ukrainian accent, but they said, they said, we want to see you. You're the master. And I was like, well, I don't know about that. I'm just a human, trying to help other people here. But I said, sure, sure. But before I demonstrate how I do this thing that I just trained you to do, um, let me see how you guys do therapy here. I first wanted to see what they were doing. So normally we tell people not to pick a very deep issue, like start with if it's 1 through 10, 10 is the worst thing you've ever been through. We tell people to do like a 4 or 5, right? So it doesn't get too intense. I forgot to give that instruction. So as soon as the practice therapist and practice client sat down, I was like, oh no, I could just tell. I was like, whoops. And it was the same thing in my demonstration. But anyhow, this is what happened. The client started saying this, I'm going through this, and this is what's going on. And they just did this short intro to their litany of problems. And basically, the therapist, the Ukrainian therapist, said this. They said, "Well, do this," and put their hand out and said, "This is what you need to do." It was pretty much direct advice giving, which is what we don't do. And when we train for counseling, we it's not that we don't give advice ever, but we try to pull back from that to really experience with the person what they're going through, let them get those emotions out, and validate their experience. That's another key aspect of person-centered approach. So anyhow, it didn't surprise me. I was expecting that I would see this direct advice giving, and they were needing in therapy somebody to give them permission to do something, right? And the person has some knowledge that the client doesn't have that they will tell them, and that will help them. That will fix their problem. So I said, okay, interesting. And then I sat down to do my session. And this is where I really knew that I didn't give the instruction because I looked right in the practice client's eyes and I was like, oh man, it's too late now. She already has her issue she wants to talk about. I prayed a little prayer. I said, let's do this thing. She starts telling me a story of how her mother is dying and she's going to be in hospice and she has to put her mother in hospice. And she's just breaking down. She was starting to get emotional. I could see some tears in her eyes. And basically, um, I just leaned in. I did the things that I had taught during the week course. I did. We call them minimal encouragers. So I leaned forward. I nodded my head. I did small things like say, right, to let her know that I was tracking her experience. And I let it go longer than the first therapist had, too. However, there was a point at which there was a pause, and I felt like the practice client had gotten her story out. So I waited for that natural pause, and then I leaned in and I just did a reflection of what I thought the emotion was. And I said, and we were doing this in Russian because I speak enough Russian to do this in Russian. And back then, it was more comfortable to do that. I don't know if I'm going to do that moving forward. I haven't seen what the culture is like yet in speaking Russian anymore. But anyhow, but I said the word tяжело, which means heavy. And not only did she break down in that moment, the entire class just, I felt it. There was people crying like audibly out loud. This is very rare for a stone-faced culture. And they got to witness the power of person-centered approach. And the first question was, what did you do? What was the technique? What intervention was that? And I was like, I wasn't doing an intervention. I was just showing you the real basics of what we just trained you to do. And it was so foreign to them to have somebody validate their emotion in an experience that it felt so good to them. And I could feel a group catharsis in that moment. I was giving this group of 30 people permission to have feelings and say that's okay. And so that's a longer story than you asked a short question, but that's what they need, and that's what I think I witnessed the first time, and I was like, okay, I'm going to keep bringing this stuff to these people that have been so repressed in so many ways and oppressed. Um, and from the mental health lens, it's such a gift to be able to give. So we've now trained probably around 200 therapists in the country that are doing this work. That when there's people talking about, hey, we have resources in Warsaw and around Ukraine, I'm like, hey, we've got people trained behind enemy lines, for the last several years now. So I'm very glad that we've been able to get this kind of ammunition, if you will, into the country. So there are therapists that know how to do this and help people through these incredibly horrific times.
That's a powerful story, and I appreciate I appreciate just listening. I think about as a therapist, I'm like, okay, these are like basic skills that we may take for granted. In many ways, they're even basic skills that exist in just general human action interactions, oftentimes between friends and family, and to see those having such impact in that culture is really powerful.
You kept using the phrase person-centered approach. What's the alternative to that? Because that's a new phrase for me. That's unfamiliar to me. It makes sense, and obviously hearing you talk about it is like, oh yeah, that's amazing. And why wouldn't that be the only way you go about counseling? What's the alternative to that you find? I know I heard you expressing that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So that the antecedent, I'm sorry, the precursor rather to
Okay.
kind of a wave of person-centered was really uh, rooted in Freudian psychoanalysis, is what it was called. And
Okay.
and God bless Freud, he was the father of talk therapy as we know it today. He really had and argued for the this idea that it's good to talk about our stuff. So he had that general premise, but the operating structure that he came from was, I'm going to study the process of why I believe problems persist through life. And his idea was twofold: that it's all related to psychological disturbances through the lifespan, and a lot of them related to our sexual drives. Not the only thing, but that was part of it. But the idea was, uh, people have the image of somebody laying on a couch and the therapist sitting behind them writing notes. It was a as the helper, I'm removed from the helpee. I'm not even, they can't even look at me. I am the subject matter expert. They are going to tell me their stuff and I'm going to analyze it and then give them some knowledge, some nugget of wisdom that's going to help them through that. I'm going to take notes, and it's not very relational. Excuse me. It's very much steeped in um, that kind of ethos, and it's sometimes easier to describe it like how it looks. You can't even look at me. With person centered, we are very much almost not quite knees to knees, but it's very intimate, and it's very much built upon the power of relationship. And saying that, I would actually say that one of my favorite quotes is from a guy named Harville Hendricks. And he says, we're born in relationship, we're wounded in relationship, and we're healed in relationship. And I believe that, that kind of highlights the person centered approach, that, when we have trauma and things that are tough in life, it's almost always relationally based. We see how bad humans can be towards each other. So I believe that some of the more modern person centered theories have looked at that added on. But this is what Carl Rogers knew early on, that relationship matters, and the quality of the relationship is what can heal. Because again, we've seen how bad people can be towards each other, and let's try to highlight the hallmark pieces of effective, healthy relationships. Even, I just, one final thought. I teach a class on trauma, and I had a student once say, what about natural disasters? But even in natural disasters, people either shake their fist at God or Mother Nature. They personify this natural disaster trauma in relational perspectives. So anyhow, that's the shortest example I could give, or explanation rather, of the difference.
That's great. And what I hear almost what you're expressing is this idea that it's a person becomes a problem to be solved,
Yes.
or a project at that
Yes.
point. And
Yeah.
the difference is the genuine care for positive regard, the way you described it, for another human. So
Yes.
that's powerful. Thanks for
Hmm.
saying that.
Yeah, you bet.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So, Josh, what's next for you? As you alluded to that early in the introduction, but talk about what's next for you as it relates to Ukraine, um, and I know you mentioned a desire to be able to move and live there at some point in the future.
Hmm.
What would be the big dream, or what would be the this is what I would love to see happen in Ukraine, and
Yeah.
what would be your hopes?
So I would start with my own personal piece that swinging for the bleachers, the big dream would be, yes, to move to Ukraine and either be there full time or at least part time, where we're kind of batting different structures around, so that I can continue to help train the mental health professionals in the country, to optimize what they're doing in helping to heal trauma. And I have, as you mentioned in my bio, I've got personal experience deploying twice in the military, to combat zones. And then I've worked pretty much exclusively with military clientele. That's been the biggest part of clinical work that I've done. Worked at the VA for several years with returning combat vets and their families. And the retreats that I've done have been primarily with military families. Um, and by the way, I should make a plug for my little book too, I've got on Amazon. It's a book that describes the model, of these retreats that I've built and studied over the years. So in the US, we had, after World War II, this is where the mental health field as we know it today, even if people aren't in the field, they know that there's social workers, psychologists, counselors, family therapists. They know that these resources are there. And even to the point where it's gotten, I hear people talking about it at coffee shops. They'll say out loud in public, my therapist said, dot, dot, dot. And this is where we're at. But a lot of the nexus of where we are today was after World War II, people were coming back from war and they used to say shell shock, soldier's heart. They're like, we got to figure something out. It's not just this term we put on people, and it's not just get a haircut, get a real job kind of work. So it really, war moved and motivated more effective mental health strategy and structure in our country. I believe this is exactly what's happening and will happen in Ukraine. So that this is where I'm poised to help, and the people I've worked with and the teams that we've put together are ready to help. And so I feel like there's going to be a wave as soon as it's safe enough to be there for more people. Um, so my dream would be to be there physically so I can help more rather than it's ridiculous flying over there. The 3 flights, 24 hours almost of flying just to get door to door. It's almost 24 hours. The second part of the dream would be to get a retreat center that we own so we can optimize doing these retreats, because I do feel like it's a gateway in for so many people. At the end of the retreat, I say, hey, if you got what you needed from this, great. If you need more, you've now learned that counseling is different than what you thought, that we're not scary, we don't wear white coats, we're relational, we want to help. And here's some resources to connect if you need help in the future. Um, the other part of the vision for me is to bring as many people along as I can. So I want to bring students and other mental health professionals from the US and abroad into Ukraine to help them help people. So I can train them in these strategies and they can help in the process. I'm very passionate about using this as a training opportunity also for people to work with military culture, to work cross culturally with Ukrainian culture. And there's so many great Ukrainian therapists, but they're all impacted by the war themselves too, directly. And I've had, uh, in my prayer life, God has spoken to me, and many people too have spoken to me about specifically some Ukrainians that know that I was struggling with not being there. They said, you need to be recharging yourself so that when the time comes, you can come here and help us. So it's not in any culturally imperialistic way. And they know that, I know that. But we need people that are not getting bombs dropped in their neighborhood every day, ready to go fight and bring reserve forces, if you will, in to help with the trauma that people have experienced. And so that will happen. That's going to happen. No, I keep telling my friends there, no war has lasted forever. You know, this isn't going to be forever, but it's going longer than I had anticipated, thought, or wanted to. It's hard for me to not get a little disheartened by what's going on, but I still have enough energy and motivation and vision to we're going to make this happen.
Yeah,
For sure.
yes. Well, fantastic. Thanks so much for taking time to join us and tell us a bit about your story and your work. We are, um, we will include in the show notes access to the resources that you mentioned, and you can send us some of the links that you may have that where people could access some of what you described. We often end, and Sam often asks this question, so I'm going to try it today. Part of our podcast, and the title of our podcast is Guideposts, which talks about, hey, go this way. This will get you to a good spot. Hey, be careful of going that way, because that's taking you in a bad direction. So as you think about the work that you're doing, any guideposts that you would want to share with our audience in closing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I'm glad to honor the tradition of this podcast too. And I like that. I like that image. So I would say one of the most common prayers people pray is, God, please open doors. And I think the thing that's missing in that prayer is the discernment to go through the door that God wants you to go through, because there's a lot of doors that will open, and even the enemy will open up some of these doors. So what I found is that I look for, I would see all these shiny things and things that look cool and overextend myself very quickly with all the doors that appeared before me. And being that I'm a fallen human just like everybody, that I would erroneously go through doors that I don't think God had planned for me. So I always recommend praying for doors to close. And this is what I've done with the season of life that I've been doing this work in Ukraine with, that God has completely optimized all the opportunities that come before me. When I've added that extra piece to say, open these doors that you want me to go through, and close the doors that I don't need to go through. Um, and just one quick testimony of that experience in action, or that advice in action. I had a prayer warrior pray for me several years ago before I even started doing this work, say, you will speak with kings. And I didn't even understand what that meant at the time. But the first big meeting that I went to in Ukraine, I had been praying about, I was like, I knew I liked this work, and I knew I was called and prepared and ready for it, but I didn't know how it would keep manifesting and unfolding. So we went to a meeting, and my handler there said, I was calling her my handler. She said, we're going to go to a meeting and talk about our work. I said, okay. We sit down at this meeting, and I'm like, this is a big meeting. It was a big table, bigger table than I'd ever sat at. Lots of recording equipment, there's some media. And I was like, who's that? And she's like, oh, that's the Minister of Health of Ukraine. And I was like, oh. And I said, who's that? That's the Minister of Defense. I'm at a cabinet meeting in Ukraine
Oh my
speaking to
gosh.
kings.
Yeah.
And I think God, I know God relishes in reassuring us of his presence. It's okay to ask for that.
Hmm.
And in closing doors, it's maybe a negative spin on a prayer, like close it, don't. But I found that it's really optimized my discernment in knowing where God wants me to go. And I can't even imagine what the next steps are going to be, because this has been mind blowing to me to see all the doors that have opened for me to have these experiences and to go in as PhD level mental health clinician in these places. It's just amazing what I've been able to do and the influence that I've been able to have. So I'm going to keep praying that prayer, have that guidepost in my life, and I hope that helps somebody that hears this.
Yeah. Yes. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you again for joining us, and blessings to you as you continue your work. And we're grateful to have had this conversation with you.
Thanks. Blessings to you guys too.
Thanks, Josh. Grateful for what you're doing.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Guideposts with Dr. Tim Stauffer. If you're finding this podcast beneficial, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Also, make sure to check out the show notes where you can find links to resources as well as an email address. We want to hear from you. Send us your questions, feedback, and topic ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening.